Thank you very much for coming. I'll introduce myself. My name is Larissa Chan, and I'm the current president for the Albuquerque Lodge, and I'm the national secretary for Chinese American Citizens Alliance. This is our panel that we've put together today. But first I want to thank Dr. Siu Wong and Paul Ju as the co-chairs for this event. They did a marvelous job, don't you think?
Yeah, thank you, Paul.
Okay, we have, you're well acquainted with Baldwin and Larissa. This is Dr. Harold Bailey. Dr. Bailey has a Bachelor of Science in Education, a Master of Arts in Special Education, and a doctorate in American Studies with an emphasis in education administration. He's a former APS teacher and coach, and a UNM facility administrator, and the past director of UNM's Afro-American Studies program. He was the first chair of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Holiday Commission that was composed in 1985, and he's also the local president of the NAACP. Then we have James Chan. You saw his 3 films, weren't they great? And then Carolyn Chan. Full disclosure, she is my mother. She's also past national president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance and a recipient of the Spirit of America Award, which is the Alliance's highest honor. And then we have Professor Maaman Rezaee. She's the assistant professor of film and digital arts at UNM. Thank you all for coming. Ask to the filmmakers, how do you decide your process for your films? Does discovery of more facts from your research and the people you interview help change the evolution of your process?
Sure. Thank you all for being here. And, again, I'm the director of Far East Deep South for some of you who may have missed it. Well, our subject really kind of fell into our laps for those of you who've seen the movie. I was on a trip with Baldwin's family to Mississippi 7 years ago, and I had no idea that there was a rich history of Chinese in the Mississippi Delta, like Carolyn's family, until I stepped foot into Mississippi and then discovered that Chinese museum there. And so, in a sense, the subject found me, and it compelled me to make a film because growing up, I never learned anything about Asians in the South. In my American history books, I learned about segregation, but I never learned that it impacted people of Asian descent in this country. And there was so much more to the story, and even the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had no idea that it impacted Baldwin's family, and we're married, by the way, if you didn't know that. Baldwin's...
Good for me to remember.
Yes, very good. Baldwin's family, as it turns out through our journey, had such a long lineage in our country and was so negatively impacted by the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it explained why their family had been separated for generations. For me, it was such a profound moment of clarity in terms of American identity, but also what we were missing in our history books, that it really motivated me not to just have this nice little family video that we kept to ourselves, but to show it with the world.
I think for me, it was, I struggled growing up not really knowing, am I American or am I Chinese? Or when can I be American and when can I be Chinese? Or when am I allowed to be American and when am I allowed to be Chinese? And I think this discovery of our past and what happened to our family, it finally brought more reconciliation and healing within our family. Just personal dynamics, family dynamics between my father and myself. It helped me figure out that my identity doesn't have to be either or. It can be both here in the United States, and that's a luxury and that's a privilege that we all have, is that we can be in a country where we shouldn't have to and don't have to choose when we are what type of people. So I'm better about that with myself now. I can be proud to be both American and proud to be both of Chinese heritage. But I think profoundly for me is that, when I grew up, I grew up with a lot of black friends. I grew up, I was in hip hop culture, and it was always my black friends that had my back. But I never knew that that the lineage would extend back 3 or 4 more generations behind me. And so when we discovered Black and Chinese living together in the South, I mean, I had learned about, Black history. I learned about the South. I learned about slavery and segregation and Jim Crow, that stuff. But I never, ever once in my life growing up thought that I was a part of that picture. And I think for us and for me personally, to find out that my history and my family with the Black community extended that far back, it just it made me feel closer to my fellow brothers, right? And so I think that that changed my whole outlook on what history was. I hated history growing up, but now I love it because now I feel like I'm a part of it.
Is this the questions for filmmakers? Or
For the filmmakers.
Nope. Okay. Just checking. I am ethnic Chinese. Our family's originally from Vietnam, but we are ethnic Chinese, born and raised in Vietnam. Left during the war, became refugees, and came to America by way of sponsorship by a Lutheran church. And so throughout all these locations, home has been a huge theme for me in my work. And I truly do believe that your home is a semblance of your autobiography. And so when I came across these miniatures at the Chinese Historical Society of America in San Francisco, the one room that stood out was the single room occupancy one. And that was we lived in a little bit bigger studio apartment for the first apartment that we lived in San Francisco. And so it was a portal right into the past. It connected my history, my parents' history, as well as to this artist's history. And so getting to know and building trust with the artist, building trust with all of my subjects is a joy and a privilege because I get to listen to their rich story and I get to validate their experiences. And that to me is profoundly important. And so I serve my community through film.
Okay. Dr. Bailey, how and why is it important to build allyship with other racial minorities?
Well, basically, we're adversely affected by some of the same problems that we face here in society. Here, being a Black man in New Mexico and America, I understand our history, but it's very informative to check out these films so we can better understand the intersection between Chinese, Asians, and Black people here in America. So, I'm encouraged to continue to work with this group. Most certainly, the NAACP is not a Black organization. A lot of people think the NAACP is a Black organization, but we're not. White people were at the table in 1909. New Mexico became a state in 1912. The Albuquerque NAACP, we received our official charter in 1915. So we have a long, rich history working for civil rights here in America. Another thing I would like to say is that I'm working with State Senator Harold Pope Jr. to formulate some type of legislation to increase penalties for hate crimes. So I'm looking forward to working with the Chinese and Asian American community.
Okay, Professor Rezaee, when you have applicants coming into your program, what is the percentage that any of them are motivated by sharing their ethnicity, like stories like these films, or is it more like, they want to do like a horror film or a science fiction film or something like that?
We have all of those. I don't know the percentage really, but something that's been, this is my third year at UNM, so something that's been very rewarding for me to see, because that's the kind of film, those are the kinds of films that I make myself, is more and more our students want to share their own stories rather than, like you said, just getting excited by the tropes of Hollywood and wanting to recreate that. So more and more we have students who are researching their own backgrounds, but they're getting excited about telling stories that might be very specific to one group or the other, but as Dr. Bailey said, all the adversities we face are very similar to each other. All the stories we have are similar to each other, and they're universal in this way that is very exciting. So yeah.
Dr. Bailey, what tools can we use to improve race relations?
Well, I think that, holding the events like this. I think from this point on, we should probably work in concert so we can have joint events. I think that if we're going to get further down the road, we're going to have to develop a collective strategy. We all have to be at the table, so when we frame this strategy, it's going to benefit not only our communities, but, communities at large. We're all people, and we need to be in that mindset that what we do for each other is going to help everybody. So I think that we need to develop a collective strategy and start doing things more together.
Thank you. So this question can go to each of the panelists is, how do you handle racism when it's directed towards you? We'll start with Larissa.
Ooh, I get the big question right off the bat. Before we finished our film, we actually had an incident at a local bowling alley. We live in just outside of Los Angeles in Pasadena, California, where they have the Rose Parade. And we're a very multi-ethnic city and fairly progressive city. And so it was kind of a shock to the system when, as we were exiting the bowling alley, we encountered somebody who made a very racially charged remark and insult to us. And this was pre-pandemic too, so it wasn't because of COVID. And it cut to the core. It really cut to the core. I had to hold Baldwin back. I think it was not for our daughter. He would have probably decked the guy. But Baldwin started going off on how long his family had been in this country. Because thankfully it was after we found all that out. And so for him to make a racial joke about us really, I think, definitely hurt us in a lot of ways. But it also gave me greater empathy, I think, for even thinking about those who came before us, many of the people that we interviewed in our film of the older generation who had to face that discrimination every single day, who had to be told to go enter through another door, or who were told that they couldn't do something because of the color of their skin. And so I think for us, rather than try to deck the guy, we're trying to fight that racism with education. And as hard as it is to try to find common ground and to love our enemy in a sense. Will Smith, the actor, said something very astute in an interview earlier this year when asked about how he dealt with racism in the entertainment industry as he was coming up. He said, there's some people that are just evil, and he kind of writes those people off. But he said the majority of people are just ignorant, and ignorance can be educated. And so we kind of look at that as every person that might have said something ignorant is somebody that hopefully through a film like ours and dialogue, that they can change their mind through empathy and through education.
And if that doesn't happen, then you can deck them. No, I'm kidding. Delete that. What was the question again? Oh, how to deal with racism? Yeah, I mean, she said most of it. I think for me also is that for me, I think now, especially with what happened over the last year and a half with COVID, and hearing some of the remarks that a local school was also having with some of their students, and we actually were able to go to that school during the pandemic and virtually to show our film to the school that was having issues where they were making fun of and attacking and doing a lot of racial remarks towards the Asian kids in all their school in the school. We were able to reach out to that principal, and we were able to show the film and he showed it not just to the Asian, like there was like a Chinese class over there. He didn't just let the Chinese class watch the film about Chinese American history. He made the entire school watch it, and this is a white principal, and then he invited the parents to come with it too. And I think that's what we really want to do with education, is like invite, not just to educate the students, but we want to pull the parents into it too, because like where are most of these students learning some of these things from, right? It's probably from their parents. It could be on purpose or it could be subconsciously, but they're learning it from someone. When my daughter was growing, was in kindergarten. She knew nothing about race. She didn't know. She was like, she goes to a Chinese immersion school, and she just thinks all her friends at school are Chinese just because they're learning Chinese. But there's black kids, there's white kids, there's Mexican kids, there's other Asian kids there, and she's like, oh, we're all Chinese because we're all speaking Chinese. But we're all Americans because we say the Pledge of Allegiance. And so it's like when you're that young, you don't see race. But then when do they start learning about race and start judging people by it? It's probably from somebody that's an adult, right? So for us to be able to pull the adults in with the students, I think that's what we're trying to do with when it comes to race. And I think also when we start learning more about like what's happened, hopefully that helps us identify with other groups, other people of color, with our African American brothers and sisters, to like, oh shoot, if I'm going through it, they must have been going through it too, right? And other people are going through it. So how can we now, instead of like looking at our own like racism towards me, like how can I use that to empathize with other people of color?
Okay, I think that how we deal with racism, we want to try to educate people, but sometimes people don't want to be educated. You can look at the news right now, and people are dealing with fake news. They don't deal with the truth. So you can try to educate people, but I think we need to concentrate on getting young people registered to vote. It's their moment in time that they can bring about positive change. So if we can get young people, because they're sharp, much sharper than us. Well, me anyway. So what I'm saying, if we can get them in that right frame of mind to register to vote, understand why it's important for them to vote, select those persons who are going to bring about positive change for everybody, then we can make a difference. And at the same time, we have to bring about positive change in policy, laws, and that's why we want to frame some legislation to enhance these penalties for people who have, engaged in hate crimes. That premeditation, that evil intent to hurt somebody based on their race, I figure that that's critical. So therefore, there should be extra punishment for that. So like I'm saying, education is good, but we have to change the rules. We have to change policy, legislation, and let the young people do their thing.
When we're talking about racism and when we're talking about systemic racism, it really is deep-rooted. It didn't start just last year. And then you look at the basis of what where racism comes from, and it boils down to fear, the fear of the other. The specificity of racism that the Black community faces is very different from the racism that the Chinese and the Asian American community faces. There's a lot of common threads, right? But fear is the foundation to me of any kind of when you other people. And so when a group is blamed for the spread of disease like smallpox, to the bubonic plague, to the China flu, it's a systemic connection to the past. There's when the fear comes up, the othering comes up, and we have this knee-jerk response to start blaming a community. When like, for instance, any kind of medical unknown, for instance, the AIDS epidemic, we turn towards the gay and lesbian community and blame them. There's always a targeted group. So my response for how I handle racism is, again, through film, being able to turn the lens onto an individual, a human pillar from the community, and be able to highlight their perspective and highlight their stories, and then be able to project that and amplify it as in like, hey, these are credible, rich histories that is the fabric of the US of A. And so for me, that's how I tackle racism, is being able to amplify other people's stories and putting it out there.
As you've seen, I was the subject in this documentary, Far East, Deep South. I had to attend the one-room schoolhouse of all Chinese children up until 1947, actually. After World War II was over, and more than 18 to 20,000 Chinese Americans, some who were native-born or aliens, or registered aliens, because they could not become citizens, were recognized, or at least were given, we had the Brides Act, the War Brides Act passed, because we helped to defend our nation against terrorism and take over by evil people. So it took that long. I was able to go to college, but I did student teaching in a all-white school. But by the time I wanted to go and teach in a school, supposedly, at least at the time, in white schools, I would not be given a license to teach. So consequently, we left Mississippi, my husband and I, and came to Albuquerque. Albuquerque to me was a complete change, although I found out later there'd been some racism here too as well. So I think racism is everywhere. But you have to educate people to understand that we are all human beings. We all have the same aspirations. We want everything you and I want the same thing for our children. I came here in 1959. I was hired right away to be a teacher. I taught in Old Town. We had kids in my class who were from the country club area. We had some who had been on welfare for generations. I had these kids in my class. I taught for about 4 or 5 years here in Albuquerque. But I feel that my career and my life has been dedicated to education of all kinds. Education about my life story, education about how we as a nation are one people. And my dad always used to say, let me tell you a story. And that was to teach us about his background and what we can learn from his life or whatever. But I want to tell you something from my life that has really been something that really has been very meaningful to me recently. I taught more than 60 years ago. Several years ago, I was waiting with my son at the hospital in the waiting room. I sat around in the waiting room until everybody had left except one lady. She said to me, to make the story short, she said, I once had a teacher who was Chinese. Well, you know what the ending was. It turned out, she said, I said, well, what was her name? Mrs. Chan. I said, I'm Mrs. Chan. We went up and we hugged each other tearfully, emotionally. And what she said to me really made me feel so great, because she said, it's because of you that I have been an avid reader all my life, because you told us that it was so important. It was a gateway to knowledge. And the other incident was my daughter took over my husband's optometry practice, and a lady dropped a package off, thinking and hoping that this package would get to me. It turned out that someone had left a message to me stating that she was in that same class 60 years ago. And she said, you know, you shared your culture with us. You motivated me to learn more about the Chinese culture. And she said, I wanted to go into medical school at first. Then I became an engineer at San Jose State. And she said, I just want to thank you for what you did for me a long time ago, because I was a very shy person at that time. And in that was a letter thanking me, and she enclosed her copy of her speech to the graduating class at San Jose State in the engineering department. And she also had worked in China installing Chinese, engineering equipment, that type of thing. So it was very heartwarming. And what my point is you never know what your life can mean to someone else. So live your life the best you can. Respect other people with dignity, no matter what their race is. And it's very difficult for us. But I think it needs to start when we're young, when you're very, very young, because they've said we've always heard this song, they've got to be taught. And what we need to do is teach them well to respect one another and each other. And I growing up in the multi-ethnic neighborhood. Our grocery store, we had all kinds of people there. not just totally in the black neighborhood, and I was exposed to all kinds of culture there. But thank you.
Well, I think everyone mentioned so many beautiful points. I like Larissa and Baldwin were talking about. Of course, my first reaction is always anger, and then a little bit of sadness. And I think it's very. I feel like we should let ourselves feel our feelings, because it's very valid when you're faced with racism that you might feel those things. But then, you know, as a brown woman, I face mostly microaggressions. The real racist remarks usually come, I'm Iranian, and they usually come when there's a terrorist attack or something like that happens, and then you actually start facing racist situations, either it's remarks or attacks or whatever. And for me, it always, something that I've studied and researched, and as a filmmaker, it always comes back to representation. A lot of it is like, that's how people see us in a lot of movies, on the media, wherever there is a Middle Eastern character, that's how they're seen, as evil, as a terrorist. So for me, again, putting it back into the work, it's been very important to tell stories of Iranian descent people and show their humanity and their complexity and their beauty. And that's something, as an educator too, I try to make sure my students learn that. How do you tell your own stories and your people's stories in the complexity? It doesn't mean we're all angels. It just means that we're people with complex behavior and backgrounds. And also, again, as an educator, it's been real important for me to teach critical thinking. I feel like if you've ever sat down and talked to a racist person, they don't have that going on for them. So I feel like learning how to think critically for young people, it broadens their horizon, and also bringing them together as a community, helping them work together, no matter the background, sexual orientation, whatever it is. I think at least I'm very hopeful for our next generation and generations to come.
Thank you. Now let's open it up to the audience. If you have any questions for our filmmakers. One thing that you mentioned in your film was that Senator Eastland sponsored a bill to bring your family over. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because was that during the exclusion, or was that right after?
So Senator James Eastland is notoriously was anti-integration. He fought to preserve segregation, and we also found out from historians he was also anti-immigration. And so it was very interesting that he ended up passing a bill that allowed Baldwin's father, Charles, to come into the country because his dad at the time didn't really fall under any of the categories to be allowed to come into the U.S., and that was in 1952. So it was after the exclusion law had been repealed, but there was a quota of only 105 Chinese that were allowed into the country, even though it had been repealed in 1943. And so that's why he needed a special bill to be passed. And if you felt some type of discord or felt like it was unresolved in a sense in the film, that was very intentional, because I think in one sense, Baldwin's dad felt very grateful for Senator Eastland, but didn't know any of his history until we actually discovered it after we had met his son. And yet, you know, we also were clearly not a fan of his record. And I always say it's kind of like, if your worst enemy saved your baby from a burning building, you would still be grateful to that enemy. But at the same time, it doesn't absolve them of all the bad that they have done necessarily, and it's up to them to, you know, to make amends for everything else. But, you know, so there's definitely a conflict there. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Sort of to add to that is, I mean, I think it really comes down to also relationships. When we talk about race and what politically things are happening, as Dr. Bailey was saying, it's complicated, but yet there's a human element of it. And I think the thing that will help us make better choices is to build relationships. And when we're talking about Senator Eastland, somehow somebody in our story that we didn't show in the film, like somebody working for Senator Eastland had a relationship with my grandfather. And that relationship was able to break through to a political figure that was anti-segregation or pro-segregation, anti-immigration. But somehow that relationship allowed him to say like, okay, well, maybe I can treat this person as a human being, at least for this moment, right? And in a weird sense, that's bad, but in another weird sense, it's like, is that considered hopeful? That we can actually build a relationship with somebody that may be our enemy and hopefully change them. So I hope that offers a glimmer of some sort of hope that we don't have to stay enemies. If you know, I think you said, you know, we just need to like get to know each other, get to talk to each other. They have to understand us, whether through our film or through education, but I think mostly through relationship.
James, in one of your films, I think it was Leon's Son, when he talks about the fine line between appropriation and cross-pollination, where do you see the line between sharing our stories and when does it get to be performative?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that sits at the front of my mind every time that I build a relationship with, I don't want to call them a subject, but they are our film. And so as filmmakers, our job is to get up close and personal and never cross that line into exploitation. And I feel that my boundaries are, if you turn the camera off, before you turn the camera on, there is that trust building that needs to happen. You validate each other's stories, and then it takes a while before you turn the camera on. And then so when you turn the camera off, you are still having that relationship with them. And so to me, that there's a fine line. There's being able to, there's that scene where Frank is, at the beginning of the film, in the middle of the film, he says that he wants to burn them so that he can live in them. And the historical society where the miniatures were at, they just freaked out. And then that moment at the end, that tender moment where he's reflecting on his grandmother, and I built that relationship up with Frank to be able to sit with him, and I knew that he was actually feeling something. And I wanted to sit and validate that, because there's a lot of trauma that he holds that's either, they come in waves of low frequency trauma and then high frequency trauma. And I think that we all carry that through all of our ancestry. And so to me, when you validate a person's trauma, they get to transform it. Because if you don't transform your trauma, you end up transmitting your trauma. So film does that. Film has a way of being able to let the audience just sit with somebody who's reflecting whether or not to burn these miniatures that he made in the last 40 years. And then he transformed it, that moment of like, I don't want to burn these. I actually want to have them around for a while. And to me, that is the power of validating a person, and also the power of film.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Do you have any? Oh, how does, with the demise of print?
It depends on what people read and believe. You know, what the source of their information is.
Yeah, so she said with the demise of print, like, so editorials Now everybody has a microphone with social media. How do you think social media has affected racial relations?
As I said before, I think it depends on what you're reading and what you believe and how you react to what you read and believe. And there is a, go ahead.
No, finish. I was just gonna ask in terms of your students, are they using, how are they working with that question? Like, are they holding that space of like, you know what, are their attention spans shorter?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I feel like social media, like maybe Sue mentioned this, it's giving a platform to everybody, right? So that means that people, well, maybe people don't believe in the facts as much, or they don't see fact as factual. But there's also this power in it where it's bringing people together, like at the protests that we saw last summer, summer before the pandemic summer. A lot of it comes from, this platform that we have that brings people together to create change. So my students, of course, they use it. Their attention span is a lot lower than, well, when I was a student, which means, short films are getting shorter, and our class times also. But I mean, we talk about social media in this evil way a lot, but I feel like understand, for me, it's always been a challenge of figuring out what is the next new media thing that's happening, the new platform, and how can they use it in their advantage to keep telling their stories, to keep having a say and having a voice in what they want to express.
I can say a couple of things about the social media. You know, it's good, and the technology brings everything right here. But I think that we still have to do some old-fashioned things as far as educating people, because a lot of black people, we don't, especially my age, we don't deal with the social media or the internet that much unless we have to. So we have to still do things like this. We have to bring people together. We have to use the film the films that they make to educate people. My mom always told me, teach the children the truth. And so social media is cool, but you can use it in a negative way too, because everything is out there, and we know that everything's out there is not correct, but it's on social media. It's on the internet. So we have to make sure that these young people have a good old-fashioned foundation, and I appreciate and respect the old school teaching that I received, because no matter what type of information that comes to you, that foundation is going to keep you intact, so you won't go this way or that way. And I think that we have to become a little bit more spiritually based. I don't go to church every Sunday, but I'm saying if you do God-like things, you're going to do good things for people. It's not like a black thing for me. You know what I'm saying? I'm securing my skin so I can work with anybody. So I have a deep appreciation for film, so keep making them and keep doing what you're doing.
I would just add that this pandemic, unfortunately, has isolated our youth in all of us. And so I think in the last year and a half, you've seen the rise of social media in terms of amplifying the positives of racial awareness, but also the bigoted aspect of racism. But it is, going back to what Dr. Bailey was saying, I think that's all the more important why face-to-face interactions and real human interactions experiences will matter moving forward to combat those messages.
All right, any other questions? In that case, I would like to thank all of our panelists for their time. Oh, sorry. Mom.
In closing, okay. More and more we have biracial families, and we have to have those people, young people, understand who they are and accept themselves as they are. Not question yourself and say, who am I? Accept yourself as you are and be proud of who you are. I have grandchildren who are biracial. They are Chinese, Hispanic, and Native American. So they have a good mix of who they are. And I wanted to share this with you today because my granddaughter, Sabina Cottrell, became a teenager today. Today is her birthday, and she was not able to be with us today. But I wanted to share with you this picture that she painted. She was in the 6th grade last year at Albuquerque Academy, and she was entered in this contest by the Anti-Defamation League. And her art teacher sent this in for the Rocky Mountain competition. She won 1st place. And it depicts a tree, and it has in it people of all colors, disabled people, all types of people. And she had to write a description of her picture that she painted. And she wanted us to all come together in peace. You have the peace here and the heart for love. And this is her statement. She did this last year when she was in the 6th grade. And the title of this is One Tree, Many Branches. And this is her statement. Everyone is human. Just like we're all human, all branches sprout from the same tree. Each branch helps the tree to catch sunlight. All branches different together. I hope that we'll all remember that and come together to become one human race, that we love and care for each other. Thank you.
I also wanted to say, just in closing, as another element of full disclosure, that Baldwin is a member of our Los Angeles Lodge, and Larissa is a member of our Greater San Gabriel Lodge, and Paula Madison is also a member of the Los Angeles Lodge. So we have an Alliance Film Festival in the organization, right? So thank you very much, all of you, for
Thank you.
participating on our panel.
Oh, yes, thank you.